In our interpretation, we need to state our degrees of freedom. The formula for calculating the degrees of freedom is r-1 times c-1. Our next step is to find the chi-square value that we calculated, which was 3.92, to find out if the corresponding p-value was significant or not for a one-tailed or two-tailed hypothesis. For example, if we had a 2x2 contingency table, our degrees of freedom would be 2 minus 1 times 2 minus 1, or 1 times 1 equaling 1. If we looked at the table critical values of chi-square in our textbook, we would first find the 1 degree of freedom and locate our chi-square value in the row corresponding to our degree of freedom. Let's use a chi-square of 3.84. If we look in the rows above that intersect with our chi-square test for independence value, we find a p-value of 0.05 for a two-tailed test and a p-value of 0.025 for a one-tailed test. Therefore, we can say that our chi-square value is significant. However, the distributions of a chi-square test for independence are positively skewed, and therefore we always have a one-tailed test and would disregard the p-value for a two-tailed test. Chi-square tests for independence values are always positive, with a possible minimum value of 0 and no maximum upper limit. As the number of degrees of freedom increases, the chi-square test for independence distributions become more symmetrical. Here's an example of how distributions become more symmetrical as the degrees of freedom increase. Let's conduct a chi-square test for independence and answer the following questions. We consider our assumptions. Open the SPSS data file survey5ed.sav and follow the directions using the variables of sex and smoker. SPSS will generate 4 tables: the case processing summary, the cross-tabulation table, the chi-square tests, and the symmetric measures. Before interpreting our findings, we first check to see if we violated our assumptions. Check the 4 cells of the 2x2 contingency table for a minimum of 10 frequencies per cell. It appears we have not violated this assumption, as there were at least 10 frequencies for each of the 4 cells. Next, we want to examine the chi-square tests table. If we have more categories than 2 for either the independent or dependent variables, we use the Pearson chi-square test. If we have an independent variable with 2 categories and a dependent with 2 categories, we want to use the continuity correction chi-square test. For this example, we would use the continuity correction chi-square test or the Yates correction for continuity. Looking at the chi-square value, we find a value of 0.337 with an associated significance level or p-value of 0.562. To be significant, the p-value must be less than 0.05 or smaller. In this case, the value of 0.56 is larger than the alpha value of 0.05, so we can conclude that our result is not significant. There appears to be no association between smoking status and gender. Next, we want to look at the symmetric measures table. This will provide information about the effect size. For the 2x2 tables, the most commonly used statistic is the phi coefficient, which is a correlation coefficient and can range from 0 to 1, with higher values indicating a stronger association between 2 variables. Using Cohen's 1988 criteria of 0.10 for small effect, 0.30 for medium effect, and 0.50 for large effect, we can find a phi coefficient of negative 0.034. Therefore, our coefficient of negative 0.034 is less than 0.10 and is considered a very small effect. If we have tables larger than 2x2, we would use Cramer's V to take into account the degrees of freedom. To determine the magnitude of Cramer's V, you must first calculate the following formula, as the magnitudes are different for the number of cells for each row and cell. Our interpretation is quite brief. However, we must adhere to APA style as provided on this slide. The interpretation begins with a statement of the association between the variables. Next, we provide the chi-square symbol first. It may be helpful to cut and paste the chi-square symbol used in this slide to use in your interpretation of your SPSS homework assignments. This is followed by the degrees of freedom and the total n of the sample in parentheses, followed by the p-value and phi value. If you have any questions, please review your textbook or post your question to Ask the Professor.